All right, friends, we are going to talk today about the journey of Paul. And I'm so excited for that. Paul has, like I said, 3 missionary journeys, and the first one's in Turkey. Before we get to all that, there might be a better way to view this. Let's see, view. If I do that, that's fine for you, but it's not as good on the Zoom. Well, there you go. When we talk about Paul, what comes to mind first? What are y'all thinking about with Paul? He doesn't like women? Tell me, you're thinking of a specific quote, maybe? It does seem as though Paul is unmarried because he says he wishes everyone could be unmarried and celibate like him. That doesn't tell us if he had once been married and just had a really bad go of it. And maybe there's an ex-wife of Paul's who out there was like, that guy was no good. But it does seem like Paul's unmarried and he's a little harsh. What else do we know about Paul? An excellent writer. I would like to read his things more in Greek because sometimes it gets really complicated reading it in English. And I don't know if that's like, we just need to say like, we all are going to read the Message version of Paul's writings where we can just take it out and say, what's he trying to say? Rather than every word, because Paul can be complicated. Yeah.
He was a Roman citizen. He was a Pharisee. He was a hardcore Pharisee.
Hardcore Pharisee.
He was a rising star, Pharisee political.
That's exactly right. He was a big deal, at least in his own mind. So Paul considered himself a big deal. That's right. How many books? Can y'all name some of the books that Paul wrote? Romans, Corinthians, Thessalonians. He didn't write Acts, but he's mentioned in the book of Acts. Luke wrote Acts. Luke and Acts are of one complete story. Lou, what did you say? Philippians, Thessalonians. Paul's, of course, like super important to us because he wrote he's the largest writer of epistles in the New Testament, right? Paul also says a lot of stuff. He says a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's contrary to other stuff that Paul said because Paul's writing to specific communities, right? Communities where he's lived and worked and he knows these people. And so what's good for the goose is not always good for the gander. So he's saying one thing to Romans, and it might be slightly different from what he's saying to the Corinthians. Maybe the Corinthians are having a lot of internal struggles. So he's like admonishing them for abusing each other. Or he's writing to the Galatians, and they're struggling with this question of Jewish versus Gentile and how do we become Christians, right? So it's a very specific, targeted letter to each community. And so sometimes when we try to apply Paul generally to all things, sometimes it gets a little wishy-washy because Paul's kind of all over the place.
Is there some kind of controversy, some discussion about, certain epistles that are attributed to Paul that he didn't actually write?
The only one that jumps to mind is the letter of Hebrews. So the only letter that stands out immediately, I could be wrong, but the letter of Hebrews is written, and people think that it may be like, I was a student of Paul's, and so I'm writing in Paul's name. Who was it? Was it Plato then Socrates, or Socrates then Plato? They're like, one, teaches the student, and the student becomes eventually the next teacher. And people are like, so if I study under Plato, I may be writing in the Platonic way of thinking, in Platonic philosophy. Pseudepigrapha. Nailed it. That was my next question for you guys. But writing, well, he was special. We love Aristotle. But that was it. People often did write in the name of someone else and say, like, I studied under this person in his way to honor your teacher, right? To honor Paul. And so there's a lot of reasons why they think this about the book of Hebrews. It doesn't affect or impact me or you very much directly. And so I don't know. Paul's letters were a big deal in real time. That in real time, people were getting these letters and then copying them and copying and spreading them out. And so in real time, they got these and they said, this is something special. This is important. And, like, look, they would have been well familiar at this point with, like, massive libraries, the Library of Alexandria, this world famous collection of stuff. Like, they would have known, these were people who had studied philosophy, people who had studied, of course, Judaism, people who were very learned, and they would have understood the significance of these writings in real time. And they began to preserve them and celebrate those. And they were significant to the communities. Paul, how can we trust the letters from Paul? Well, first of all, it's straight from the horse's mouth. These are written by Paul, and these are verified by people who knew Paul, and they were copied by people who knew people who knew people who knew Paul, right? That there was never a point where it was a broken chain. We said, well, we lost these for 100 years and then refound them. It was a big time in real time, and people knew Paul, people who knew Jesus knew him. So it gets it directly from himself. And other people were writing about Paul in pretty quick real time. There were other early church writers, early Christians like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Eusebius, right? They were all writing and referencing Paul, saying this guy is a big deal. So what do we know about Saul of Tarsus?
He grew up as a thinker, the Pharisee, Tarsus.
That's exactly right.
He was well educated. Again, when I bring up the fact that he's Pharisee, I think it's very key, especially when you're trying to comprehend his letters to these different churches and groups, because one trait of our Pharisees, they despised Hellenism. And that's probably one of the greatest things he was combating.
And, that's exactly right. This is an interesting contradiction, that he's raised in Tarsus. Anybody know where Tarsus is exactly? I'm going to show you a map in just a minute. But Tarsus is in modern day Turkey, right? So he's raised in the Hellenistic world. So he's not raised in Jerusalem. He will go to Jerusalem as a young person, but he's raised in this Greek world. And so as he's traveling around Greece, as he's traveling around Turkey and Syria and Lebanon, he's traveling through the places that he would have traveled a lot as a child, but he grew up in Tarsus, which is absolutely Hellenized. And so part of his work as this apostle to the Hellenized world, to the greater diaspora of all humanity, when he's preaching to the Gentiles, it's because he grew up with the Gentiles, but he grew up as a Pharisee. So he grew up as a dispersed person. His father was probably a tent maker. He inherited this trait from his family. His father would have been also a Pharisee, very learned, very scholarly. So here he is as a Jew, not of Israel, not in Israel, who's going to be sent out to the people who are not in Israel, right? But the idea, he tells us very specifically, he says, I was not only a Pharisee, I was the ultimate Pharisee. I was circumcised on the 8th day. I followed the law my entire life, everything that you're supposed to do perfectly. And he goes and studies under a guy named Gamaliel, which must have been a big deal to the people back in the day. Gamaliel's still famous to us. We still have other secular writings about Gamaliel from the time of Jesus, that he was one of the big names. He was somebody who was on the Sanhedrin. Now, y'all remember, Michael's doing a good job telling us and trying to describe the power structure in the time of Jesus. The power structure is like this. The Sadducees owned the building. They had the temple, and God was in the temple. So if you want to worship God, you go to the temple. The Sadducees own the temple. To go and worship God, you've got to give a sacrifice. How do you get sacrifice? You buy a sacrifice. The people buy and sell the sacrifice, they make money. So all this money is coming in to the temple. So the Sadducees were wealthy. Maybe not by our standards, but like in the day, they were the power players of society. They controlled the temple. The Pharisees could work at the temple, but didn't necessarily have to. The Pharisees were this other group that weren't connected to the sacrifice. So the Pharisees could go anywhere. So if you're a Pharisee, you could be in Jerusalem just as easily as you could be in Tarsus, or you could be in Galilee or anywhere else. So that's why in Galilee, Jesus is confronting the Pharisees. Why is Jesus encountering mostly Pharisees in Galilee?
Because that's what's there.
Because that's what's there. Because the Sadducees don't go to Galilee because the temple is in Jerusalem, right? So you have the Pharisees over here and the Sadducees over here. All modern day Judaism descends from the Pharisees. Because when they destroyed the temple, 65 to 70 AD, there's no more temple, there's no more Sadducees. You can't worship in the temple without the temple. So the Sadducees are wiped out. The Pharisees continue on and on. But then you have the Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin is kind of like this weird amalgamation where they're kind of the governing body of all the Jews, mostly made up of Sadducees, some Pharisees, some important men, but they're the liaison to Rome. So like when big things come from Rome, it comes through the Sanhedrin, and the governor, whether it's Pontius Pilate or Herod or whoever it is interfacing with the Sanhedrin. Say we have our own governing body, if that makes sense. So you have the Sanhedrin. So Gamaliel is on the Sanhedrin. So Gamaliel is a big deal. He's not only a famous teacher, not only do we have things about him and his teaching, it's a big deal, but he was also a power player. So here's Paul studying. So this is like maybe like the Senate, the United States Senate, right? So not only was I like raised up in the United States, not only was I raised up in the government, I grew up in Washington, D.C. itself, and I studied under Joe Byrd. Do y'all remember Joe Byrd from West Virginia? I was trying to think of a a politician that won't make somebody mad. Joe Byrd from the great state of West Virginia. He passed away, but he was a big deal when I was coming up. Half of the state of West Virginia is named after Joe Byrd because he like got pork barrel spending to like infrastructure the whole state. So Joe Byrd, right? He said, I was raised in the school of Joe Byrd himself. Like I studied politics under the guy who teaches. Yes. I see it on my computer, but not on yours. Yeah. Thanks, Lou. You're so sweet. I did that to Mike the other day and we had to rearrange it. He is a Roman citizen. Growing up in Tarsus in Turkey, that's the Roman Empire. So he's growing up as a fully blooded Roman, which is a big deal. Back in the day, you could be a subject of Rome, which didn't grant you any Roman rights. You could buy your way into Roman citizenship. So you have enough money, you can kind of work it out that way. Or most significantly, if you're born as a Roman citizen like Paul, which is going to give him certain rights, like appealing to Rome itself, appealing to the emperor. So he's going to go before the Caesar, and this is a chance for him to proclaim God to the very highest powers in the world. To say, I'm going to appeal straight to the president of the United States, straight to the King of England, right? Because I'm a Roman citizen, I have the power to do that. He spoke Aramaic. We can see that through his writings and what he's doing, but he's a native Greek speaker. So most likely he's speaking in Koine Greek, raised in Koine Greek, writing in that, which is slightly different than modern Greek. This is how the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. And maybe that's why it's kind of confusing for us when we're reading, because it's translated from Greek to English. And sometimes his words, his sentences can get a little clunky, if you know what I mean. So he's raised in Tarsus. Where is Tarsus? Tarsus is one of the larger centers of trade in the Mediterranean coast, renowned for its university. Tarsus had been among the most influential cities in Asia Minor since the time of Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC. Of course, Alexander the Great rises up power. Now, what's interesting, he's a young man as he's like consolidating power, and he begins marching through the world. Mike did a great job telling us how they marched into Jerusalem and met all the people. And it's like, whoa, I see him. And he even interfaced between the Israelites at the time and the Samaritans in Samaria. And Alexander had studied enough to know that there was, in fact, a difference between those in Jerusalem and those in Samaria. The interesting thing about Alexander the Great is he never stops one place and he never goes home. So the entire work of Alexander the Great is this like movement. He's always moving east, and he eventually dies somewhere between like in the hills of Afghanistan, Pakistan, on the way through Greater Persia. He just keeps moving and expanding, and everywhere he leaves is now become Greek, and this changes the world. And it's going to be kind of, before you have the Romans, you have kind of the Seleucids, and before them you have this kind of Hellenization of the world. So Alexander the Great, fantastic. So we see Tarsus right here in the armpit, not far. So if you look at Jerusalem, and then you go straight north from Jerusalem, you cruising through Syria, and then Lebanon, and then Syria, and then you hang a left into Turkey, boom, you're right there in Tarsus. This is in part why Israel is the center of the universe for geopolitics. In the Fertile Crescent, anyone coming from Europe into Asia, anyone coming from Asia into Europe, anyone coming from Europe and Asia down into Northern Africa, everyone is going to be passing through Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. So some of the biggest cities in the world, of the ancient world, were going to be in that whole region right here, from Antioch down to Damascus, down to Jerusalem. This is where people are coming and consolidating, where trading is happening. This is also where all the wars are happening, right? This is where armies are clashing in every direction. So he's over here, kaboom, just on the very farthest point of Turkey. Again, this is going to be significant because Paul is going to spend 30 years of his life traveling. We think about the missionary trips of Paul. These aren't like short trips. This isn't like, hey, I just stopped in to tell you about Jesus Christ. See you later. His first missionary trip is going to take 4 years. About 4 years. So what that says to me is he travels somewhere and then sets up shop for a few months or 6 months at a time. Then he goes to the next place and sets up shop. So he's getting invested in the community. It's, of course, a different world, right? He's able to travel because they have Roman roads, because traveling is pretty easy, because they've colonized the world, at least this part of the world. There's also this worldview of hospitality. So he's entering into people's homes and people are allowing him and they're feeding him and they're housing him and when he's setting up a church, he's there 100% all the time. We also know that along his travels, he's always working. You know, isn't it amazing how the Lord works? There's not a lot of jobs that no matter where you go, you can just do your job. But tent making is one of those. That everywhere he goes, somebody has a hole in a tent. Everywhere he goes, somebody needs some leather work repaired or some canvas work, right? So everywhere Paul can go, what does he need? His needle and thread, his big hooks. Paul can set up shop and he provides for himself. And that's a big deal. He said, I don't want to be a burden on these people. I'm coming to serve you and to love you. So Paul is coming in. We're going to see kind of these are the big centers of the ancient world, of the Roman world. He's going to go visit Colossae for the Colossians, Ephesus for letter to the Ephesians, Thessalonica, Thessalonians, Philippi, the Philippians, right? Corinth. He's going to do it all. Our first experience of Paul, of course, is at the stoning of Stephen. I painted this picture last week, and I tried to capture right here. The people are laying down at the feet of Saul, their cloaks. What does that signify? Remind us of the story. It comes from the book of Acts, the 2nd chapter of Luke. What does the stoning of Stephen, what do we experience with Saul at that moment?
Well, he was being martyred. Saul, Tarsus at that time, stood there and held everybody's coats, kept an eye on them so they would have more arm movement to be able to throw more blocks.
I gotta take my jacket off, get my stoning arms ready, right? I'm going it's like when two guys get in a fight and they like take their shirts off, right? It's like, no, it's gotten real. We like lost our shirts. They're like, I gotta take off my cloak, but it's also a symbol of his authority. And here's Paul, who is sent as a missionary of Judaism. He's sent out. This is kind of like there's the Reformation, and then you have the Inquisition, right? He's sent out as like the enforcer of the Inquisition, almost. We're saying there are these new groups of Christians who are leading people astray, and we're going to go and assert dominance. We're going to go and reassert the power of the Sanhedrin. And so he's coming as a representative. He's sent by the high priest himself. It's like I'm being sent by, who's the head of the Senate? Is it Chuck Schumer? Like I'm being sent by Chuck Schumer out to do the bidding of the U.S. Senate, right? I have the authority of our government behind me, everyone. And so they recognize him. Stephen is preaching and proclaiming the word of God. He looks up and he sees kind of sky part, and he sees like the angels there ready to receive him. And it's this beautiful speech. And of course, the author of Acts, gives us this beautiful sermon about Jesus Christ, the living Son of God. Stephen is killed, and Paul feels good about it. Well done, Paul. This was great. Let's go celebrate with some Manischewitz and a good kosher beef roast, right? Like this, we did awesome. Another Christian bites the dust. Well done. He's on his way to Syria. He's on his way to Damascus. Damascus? Is that Syria or Lebanon? Lebanon, right? Syria. Okay. So he's on his way to Damascus to do more. He's like, man, that was so successful. We got one. We killed him. Awesome. Let's go do it again and again. Stephen was the first Christian martyr and the first deacon, which gives us an example of how we should treat our deacons from this point forward. We've been trying to martyr them ever since. Go ahead, Tom. Did you have a follow-up question? Yeah. It was big enough to get recorded in the Bible, to get recorded in the book of Acts. There are a lot of other Christians who died along the way, and those stories aren't all captured, but Stephen's is. This was a pivotal moment. This was a transition moment. Jesus has risen, gone into heaven, and now we're waiting. We're waiting. The Holy Spirit has come. It's empowered us, but we're waiting. And how do we live in this harsh world where we're not with Jesus? We are with the Holy Spirit. He says he's coming back. We don't know when. This kingdom is coming. The kingdom has started, but it's not fully here yet. How do we live in this space? And now we're being killed. And now we're being killed. And like, this is a rude wake-up call. Like, it was so good on the day of Easter morning, and yet now persecution. And so it's a pivotal point. And Paul is sitting in the very center of that. Catherine. The crowds gathered around Stephen. They stoned him to death, but Paul was the authority. Paul was the one who condemns him and says, if not saying it himself, his presence is the authority, where people recognize him. By laying their cloaks at his feet, it's the symbol of, we see you as the one who's in charge of this. Paul was not Christian yet. Saul is not yet Christian. As a matter of fact, that leads to my next one. My daughter, we've been reading a lot of Roald Dahl at the house with my 7-year-old. And so she asked me the other day in the car, she said, it might sound weird, but can we see like a video of someone being beheaded, like a queen? Because we were reading about like the queen, like losing her head. And we're like, no. And that is weird. Like, psycho.
Because the whole charity system for the Hebrew people was to be able to take care of widows and orphans. And Stephen was one of the ones who raised his hand and said, what is that? You're becoming a Christian, but you have no one to take care of our widows and orphans. And they said, great, you volunteered, we are going to ordain you to do that. And so in a way, he represented a different authority structure that was coming up through the church, through the nascent church, which was against the authority structure.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Thank you for that, Lou. And so Stephen's so rich and profound to us, and the life and ministry of Stephen teaches us so much about servant ministry. And so we celebrate Stephen, especially because of the deacons in our lives. So Saul is on his way now to commit more mass murder. Like, he's on his way to rout out the Christians, to round them up, kill them if we got to. Where he has this amazing, beautiful, profound experience, right? He's riding on his horse, blinded by a light, gets knocked down, loses his sight for how many days? 3 days. 3 days. He loses sight. Everyone around him, they don't see anything. They're all like, what's going on? He's like, guys, I just had this tremendous experience. I heard the voice of God calling out, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he's like, who the heck are you? What's happening to me? He's like, I am Jesus Christ, the one who you're seeking to destroy. And so he has this crazy experience. He has to go and find this guy named Ananias. He says, go find Ananias in Damascus. And Saul's like, okay, I'm totally blind. It's going to be real tricky, but I'll do it. And then the angel comes to, God speaks to Ananias. He's like, I'm going to send this man named Saul, and you need to pray over him. And Ananias is like, hard pass. Absolutely not. That Saul who's been killing Christians, that Saul who's actively persecuting us, you want me to let the guy into my house who is going to put me in prison and maybe take my life? Now imagine this. Angel of the Lord has come to you. You're speaking to the divine and you're arguing, right? You're like, hard pass. And yet somehow almost every story in the Old Testament, New Testament, when people experience God, or the voice of God, or an angel of the Lord, they're almost always arguing. We're like, Sarah, you will have a baby. Yeah, right. You know, like every time. Joseph, your wife is going to be great with child. He's like, absolutely not. I'll leave her in peace, right? Every time. Zechariah, who's the father of John the Baptist, right? He can't believe that his wife is going to get pregnant. If an angel of the Lord comes to you at any point, just say yes. Just say whatever you want. It's all good. But Ananias finally receives Paul into his house, pray over him, restores his sight, and Paul has this conversion. This, we call it in Greek a metanoia. It's a transformation of the heart. It's, I was walking down the road to the west, and I've turned, and now I'm walking down to the east. I've completely changed my path. I'm walking in a completely different direction. My old life is dead to me, and the new life is born again. So the conversion of Paul, metanoia, it's that Greek word. It's a word in Greek, meaning the transformation, or even the kind of like the revolution of the heart, right? And immediately, Paul proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying he is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, is this not the man who wreaked havoc in Jerusalem of those who called upon his name? And has he not come here for this purpose, to bring them bound before the chief priests? But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews. And I love this. And everyone was completely confused and baffled by this behavior. All those who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. He's on the road for 30 years. Today, the scripture is of the burial of Moses. It says Moses was buried in a place where no one would know. He's buried at Mount Nebo. And this is a picture of Mount Nebo for your viewing pleasure.
Was Christ the Bible?
Christ is a Greek word that means simply Messiah, which is a Hebrew word that means literally the direct translation of Messiah is the one covered in oil, because that's one who's anointed, when you're anointed with oil, or king, right? Who's anointed? The anointed one is king. But king can mean something specific. Anointed is someone who's been called by God, covered by God in this beautiful moment. So Jesus is the anointed one. Jesus is the king, the Messiah, the Christ. So when we say he is the Messiah, the Christ is just the same word. If you say the king, the Messiah, the Christ, it's all the same. So Paul sets off on his journeys. This is the route he's going to take. Go and jump on a boat from Syria, go down to the eastern corner of Cyprus, over to Paphos, all the way up into Turkey. His first trip is entirely within the confines of modern day Turkey. At the time, it wasn't modern day Turkey. It was just Rome. But that's how we had today. Has anybody ever been to Cyprus? I think Nancy Hamner's son lives in Cyprus. Nancy Hamner is absolutely the most wonderful and interesting person, and probably the holiest person I know. She's not able to drive as much anymore, but if y'all have a chance to go visit Nancy Hamner, you should. He travels from the years 45 to 49 AD. Paul was born somewhere around the time of Jesus. He's either about 5 years younger to 5 years older. He's born somewhere between 5 before Common Era and 5 Common Era. So we're not exactly sure because they didn't keep records quite the same way. But he meets up with this guy named Barnabas. Barnabas was a good and faithful Christian already. So together with Barnabas, who's from Cyprus. So why does he go to Cyprus first? Well, because Barnabas is from Cyprus. He's like, let's go to my home. It's awesome. It's this beautiful island, largest island in the Mediterranean. Let's go. So they traveled across Barnabas' homeland, preaching in synagogues, staying with everybody. Fun fact about Cyprus, once given to Cleopatra as a gift by Mark Antony. Now that's bold. You know, like if it's usually like on Valentine's Day on the way home from work where I'm like, oh no, I have to get Katie something. Mark Antony's like, I'm going to give you this entire island, right? It probably wasn't fully his to give, but that's a gift, man. I think you reminded us that there were several Cleopatras.
Yes.
But-
she was the seventh.
But this was the good one.
Yes.
This is the one. This is Elizabeth Taylor.
One of Saul's granddaughters.
Well, there you go.
Not Saul's
one of, according to legend, they then proceeded to Kition, current day Larnaca, where they supposedly met with Lazarus. Do you remember Lazarus who got healed and raised from the dead? Did y'all ever see the movie with William Dafoe from the 70s? It's about Jesus. The Last Temptation of Christ. Did you ever read the book? In the movie, of course, William Dafoe is Lazarus. He gets healed by Jesus, comes out, and is like living his best life. But Lazarus will die again. I mean, it's an interesting follow-up to the story. Like, whatever happens to Lazarus, he eventually will die. In Last Temptation of Christ, they kind of envision this as him being killed for having helped spread the fame of Jesus and getting people wound up. So it's like they go and take Lazarus out and kill him. But legend has it that Last Temptation of Christ was wrong, and that he actually moves to Cyprus, and they meet up with Paul, which is awesome. I don't know if that's true, but I hope it is. He'd be like, "Hey, weren't you that guy that was dead for 3 days? Like, can you tell me more about that? Like, what was that like?" Huh. From Kition, they moved along the coast to Paphos, where Paul was supposedly tied to a pillar and whipped for trying to preach Christianity to the locals. One of the things that seems universal about Paul's life is he seems to have annoyed a lot of people everywhere he went. There's going to be this running theme of him getting arrested, chased out of town, beaten half to death, left for dead. It seems he had a real penchant for just being as obnoxious as possible. I mean, obviously there are people who loved him. It's kind of a love-hate kind of guy. You either love him or you hate him. Yeah, very strong flavor. But this is the beginning of his first mission. For 4 years, he's traveling. And one of the first things that happens is he gets taken, tied to a pillar, and whipped. He mentions being whipped in Corinthians chapter 2. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Why is it 40 minus 1? Because they said 40 would kill a person. So they beat you to the very edge of death. He said 5 times that happened to me. It's like, Paul, maybe like a little softer landing. Maybe be a little bit more gentle as you're preaching. 5 times they nearly killed him. But he does not say where in Corinthians. But the pillar that Paul was tied to when he was whipped in Paphos, at least according to legend, still stands in front of the church. Kind of exciting. From there, so he travels across the island of Paphos, gets back on a boat. He's going to go up to Italia and Perga. This is kind of the Roman ruins. We have these Roman ruins of these magnificent cities. This must have just been like an incredible place to come into. From Perga, they finally reached. From Perga, so where we go? From here to Perga, we go up to Anatolia, Italia, Pisidia, coming back down. And we're finally going to go from Perga back to Antioch, where the party began. Let's see. From Perga, they finally reached Antioch, where Paul began to spread the word to the local Jewish community. Initially, it went very well, leading to an invitation to speak on the Sabbath, but part of the community soon turned envious about the strong popularity enjoyed by this preacher, and they eventually managed to push Paul out of the city. This is in the crossroads of the Aegean, the Mediterranean Sea, and the central Anatolian regions, formerly the border of Pisidia and, I'm sure y'all, you're scholars of ancient Mediterranean travel, but this is a crossroads. This is where people are coming, right? And this makes it almost every place where Paul is going to go is going to be a major city or a port city, especially when we get into Greece. We're hitting these big places where we're going to have the most impact on people. That we're going to take that word and spread it further and further. Paul and Barnabas left a city just south of Ankara in present-day Turkey, but were forced to leave again, this time for nearby town of Lystra. Paul healed a sick man here, and local pagan community began to believe that he was sent by God. But soon enough, the same people who contested him in Koine reached Lystra that, hey, listen, Paul was walking, and so could everybody else. The people who chased him out of town said, hey, Paul's 2 towns over. Let's go and get him there, right? So they follow him down, and they convince that city to force him out as well. Finally, Paul travels back to Antioch, where the party began. A city of ancient Syria, now in modern-day Turkey, where his journey originated. Here, Paul reports that through his message, many pagans got to know the word of God. This is interesting, right? It's interesting that Paul is going to be traveling around Turkey initially. This is the region where he grew up. These are the communities that he would have known. It's a language that he would have spoken. You know, I still feel somewhat of an immigrant to the great state of Alabama. I feel more integrated to West Virginia. Like the hills are in my bones. My grandfather would have thought of himself as an Italian hillbilly, right? He would refer to himself all day long as both Italian and hillbilly. There's something about being the place of your birth where it's like, I just speak the language. I just know the air. The trees make a little bit more sense. And I could be in Alabama for the rest of my life, which would be a wonderful thing, which I love it. It's a beautiful home. And all I say, but I'm from the hills. And it's something that Paul goes back to his people, where he's speaking like a native language, right? After 14 years, this is letter to the Galatians, I went up again to Jerusalem. Paul's been around and about. Paul's going to have several times where he returns to Jerusalem. There's going to be major issues around Jerusalem in Paul's life. One of the major issues is the destruction of the temple. One is going to be a major famine. Because of the major famine, this is before the destruction of the temple. Because of this famine, Christians are suffering. So we got to take care of the Christians in Jerusalem. Paul's planting churches. The word is spreading. It's all good, but there's a famine in Jerusalem. People are suffering. We've got to take care of those. So I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. Took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders. I presented to them the gospel that I preached to the Gentiles, because he's mostly preaching to Gentiles, right? I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was Greek. Now we're going to get somewhere interesting. Now we're starting to get into this conversation with the Christians in Jerusalem. Who's first into the kingdom? Who's really technically a Christian? In Jerusalem, they're saying, well, it's Jews. Jesus came as a Jew for Jews and through Judaism out into the world. And so out in the world, if you want to be a Christian, you have to become like us. You have to become first a Jew and then a Christian, right? And to be a Jew, for these guys out there, number one thing you've got to do, a little snippety snappity. You got to be circumcised. And you know what seems awful? You know, when I lived in Kazakhstan as in the Peace Corps, in Kazakhstan, the Muslim tradition there was to circumcise boys when they were, I think, between 8 and 10 years old. Now, you circumcise an 8-year-old baby, you don't have much memory of that. 8-day-old baby. But when you circumcise an 8-year-old, they have a much more vivid memory, I think. And so, there was a party for this kid. This family got together. They were throwing a big party, and they didn't tell him anything about it. They didn't tell him about the old snippety snap. They just told him, today, you're becoming a man. And he was so excited. All the family came in, and they made a bunch of food and all the celebration and music and family and friends. And it was great. And he's like, today, I'm going to be a man. And then the imam took him around the corner to like the little surgical, seat that they had set up. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait, what? I no longer want to be a man. And this poor little child, like the rest of the day, he looked very sad and pitiful, as I think would any of us. It was very understandable. But they're asking these grown men to get circumcised. And so Paul said, I've been preaching to the Gentiles for 4 years. I've been converting people. I've been doing the Lord's work. I've taken the message of Jesus into the world. It's been great. All these Gentiles are being saved because Jesus came for Jews and the Gentiles. What does he say? That Christ came, well, neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male or female, nor life or death. Nothing will separate us from the very love of God. Like, we are all called into God's kingdom. This is wonderful. And the last thing that we want to do is put up barriers to people becoming Christians. The last thing we want to do is create blocks for people to jump over and leap over, or mountains for them to have to climb over to understand the faith of Jesus Christ. And you know what is a massive stumbling block for most grown men? Would be circumcision. Do y'all remember the great story? That's the how to say this nicely. When Dinah was abused, and the sons of Jacob say, the man who abuses Dinah he says, he goes to the family and says, I love Dinah and I want to marry her and make her my wife. And so the brothers get together. These are the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Isaac, I guess. And they say, sure, you can marry our sister Dinah, the one you just brutally attacked. Sure, no problem. But every man in this whole village, every man has to be circumcised. And the guy's like, no problem. Totally worth it. And on the third day, when everyone's at their weakest, when like the men can barely move, the sons of Isaac go in and they killed all the men in the town. And it's like really hardcore. The Bible's fun, isn't it? And so they're preaching in Jerusalem that you have to go through this really high bar for entry. And Paul's saying that's not what Jesus came to say. That's not what I've been preaching for the last 4 years. And that's not faithful, right? That he came for all the world freely. You know, there's contrasting messages, because Paul's going to say several times, saved by grace, saved by grace, saved by grace, or saved by faith, kind of interchangeable at different times. Martin Luther, who is a great hero of our faith, Martin Luther has this great epiphany one day. He says, oh, we're not saved by works, but it must be like Paul said, that we're saved by faith. And so we of faith are justified. We're justified by our faith into eternal life. And so it's not about, paying for alms. It's not about serving in the crusades. It's not about paying off our sin debt. It's not about buying, what are they called, Lou? Indulgences. It's not about buying our way into heaven. It's about our faithfulness. But I think there's a better argument to be made that when Paul writes about this again and again and again, he's saying it's not about our faith in Jesus. It's about the faithfulness of Jesus, that we're justified by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to die on the cross for us. That it requires no action on our behalf because Jesus took all the action on himself. So we are saved. We are justified by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to die for our sins on the cross. Does that make sense? And in that, he's saying, so since you're saved by faith, you're saved not by your own strength or your own wisdom or your own power or your own grace. You're saved by Jesus. Then all of us, that means all of us. When he says he's come into the world to save those who are lost, it means all of us. He saved the world, the whole wide world. So we don't need to put this barrier of circumcision out there. But when Cephas, who's Cephas? Do you remember that? Cephas. Peter. When Peter comes to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with Gentiles. It's like this two-faced hypocrite. This guy used to eat with Gentiles. This guy used to be super cool. And now look at him. And now he's saying they can't be with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas, who I spent 4 years walking across the earth with, come on, Barnabas, leaving me out here. But even Barnabas was led astray by this hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before all them, just remember that he gives no shits, right? Paul seems to have this penchant for just telling the truth, no matter what. It doesn't matter if I'm going to make you really upset. He said, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Why should the Gentiles live like Jews if you who are Jewish live like Gentiles? It's like, you guys are like maniacs. This is insane. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through the faith of Jesus Christ. Maybe the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Not by my faith in Jesus, but by Jesus' own faithfulness to us. Does that make sense? That all people are welcome. That Jesus Christ, not to condemn the world, but to save it. Here ends the first journey of Paul. So Paul is converted. He sets out on this mission. He travels his first time just through Turkey, comes back to Antioch, has this kind of big blow up with Peter. They're wrestling. What stands out to you? Now it's about the year 50 AD. So it's been about 12, 13 years since Jesus died. So Jesus hasn't long been gone. Obviously, people are around who knew Jesus in real time. But Jerusalem still stands. There's political tensions. There's been already at least one revolt in Jerusalem, one major protest from the Jews against the Romans. There's political unrest. Nobody's really happy, but Jerusalem still stands. The temple still stands. The church is being spread. What stands out to you so far?
Peter was calling Cephas. The argument in the positions like that, Paul parts of synagogue and marries and goes out to the Gentiles. But he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He's arguing the point of not having to be before you become a fisherman. And the fisherman who walked with Jesus is saying that he did. It just seems to be a bit of an irony.
A little ironic. We all have capacity for hypocrisy within ourselves, don't we? And one of the grace-filled things about Saint Peter, I think you were talking in a Bible study, maybe you were talking about this. But one of the reasons why we know about Peter's failings, we believe is because Peter probably was the one who told these stories about himself again and again and again and again. So when Matthew is telling the story of Peter fleeing naked into the night, not just leaving Jesus, they're at this fire, he's wrapped up, and why he's wrapped up in a garment with nothing else underneath of it, I mean, that is another conversation, but he's all wrapped up, and he denies Jesus 3 times. Jesus is just inside. He's inside the building. And he says, I don't know this man. I don't know this man. I don't know. The 3rd time he gets so upset, they go to grab him. They grab his cloak, and he says he runs away naked in the night. It's like, what the heck is Peter doing naked? Was it Peter who's naked fishing on the boat as well and jumps into the sea when he sees Jesus walking on the seashore? It's like, guys, a little clothes up in here, a little decency. Anyway, Peter, we believe, tells the stories on himself. He tells the story of his own failing, of his own lack of faith. He must have been the one going to these churches saying, I was the one who deserted Jesus. I was the one who told Jesus, who cut off the ear of the soldier next to Jesus. I was the one that Jesus called Satan. Said, get thee behind me, Satan. I was the one who messed up again and again and again. And yet, Jesus loved me. Peter must have told these stories on himself. And what I love about Peter is that he keeps messing up and keeps growing. And he keeps learning and evolving. He's the one who steps out of the boat, which is amazing. And the sea's roaring all around him. And he begins to sink. And I wonder if that was just so compelling to say, I'm the one who messed up the most. And yet Jesus loves me. And so think how much more Jesus can love you. So Peter and Paul, they have some disagreements. And yet that should also give us hope today over us Christians who sometimes bicker and fight. Should we go this way or that way? Should our liturgy look like this or like that? How do we celebrate the Eucharist? Who's invited? Sometimes we as Christians can also bicker and say, this is an ancient thing. The very first Christians did it even better than we did. And we're way more hardcore about it. And yet there's still the grace of the Holy Spirit that unites us. That it's not about my belief and your belief. It's about God moving through all of our community to make God's church, to make God's kingdom here on earth. And then, of course, Paul starts on his second adventure in 49 to 52 AD. This is going to expand further into Greece. This is going to be some of the big highlights where years later he'll write to the Philippians and Thessalonians and Corinthians. And we have a lot more to talk about in 2 weeks. Do you have any other questions about Paul?
Is he writing at this time?
My understanding is that a lot of his letters are coming later after he's visited 2 or 3 times. And so he's writing back. But I would imagine Paul had a letter writing campaign always going on. But his letters, like 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, are coming after he's established churches there. And he's looking back, trying to correct them, trying to support them. Do you have a question, Claire? I think it's N.T. Wright who has. I wish Lou were here to answer this question. N.T. Wright is a wonderful Anglican resource. Sometimes N.T. Wright can be a little too much. Sometimes N, like Norbert, T, Testament, N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright was an Anglican bishop in England, prolific writer, and he wrote some really simplified books. He writes really big things like the proof of Jesus, but he also writes a series of really simple books of like very, very simple to very, very short. And he has a whole series about the Gospels and some of the letters of Paul. And I probably have 3 or 4 other books in my office. If you come by my office, I can just give you something probably. Next week, we're going to have brunch. Come to brunch. And let me end. Here ends the let me all right.